welcome all of you to our workshop as part of the Caritas Leeds Criminal Justice Inquiry. We'll start off with a prayer, and I've just been thinking of which prayer should I use, and in a pile of stuff that I have on my left here, the paper that came to the front is the Serenity paper, so as a prayer. So we'll say that. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, and accepting hardship as a pathway to peace. Taking, as Jesus did, the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, and trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you in the next, through faith in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, Mother of unfailing help, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So I just want to very briefly set the scene for this workshop. Over the last 2.5 years, the Caritas Leeds Criminal Justice Commission has been learning from and listening to people involved in the criminal justice system. This included, amongst others, prisoners, ex-offenders, professionals within the system, victims of crime, and third sector agencies working in the system. Our inquiry resulted in the launch last October of a formal report titled Justice and Mercy, which is this and can be accessed through our website, but there's also online resources. Our report includes a number of challenging recommendations for action, and we have progressed by developing an action plan to address these recommendations. One of the key themes of our inquiry was definitely the issue of restorative justice. So tonight's workshop is focusing on this particular important aspect of restorative justice. I'm very pleased to introduce Caroline Rountree, who is going to lead us in this workshop this evening. Caroline has been working in the criminal justice system in various roles for the last 13 years and as a restorative justice practitioner for 8 years. At present, she is the lead practitioner for restorative justice in Leeds as part of the agency called Restorative Solutions. Has worked in a similar roles for Yorkshire Mediation Service and indeed HMP Leeds. So Caroline, you're very welcome, and thank you for sparing the time to spend it with us this evening. It's over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for inviting my organisation to come and speak with you and talk a little bit about restorative justice. It's a term that not an awful lot of people know. However, whenever it's explained a little bit more, it's one that people tend to recognise a bit. Like has been said, I have been working in this role in various capacities for about 8 years now. So I'm well aware that it makes sense in my head, and I hope to explain it in a way that makes sense to your head. However, as we go along, if there's questions that you have, feel free to pop them into the chat bar. You've got like a little chat function at the bottom there. I'm happy to look at those questions as we go along. If there's anything that you need me to go over or anything that doesn't quite make sense, sometimes I have a habit of using terminology that isn't in popular parlance. Sometimes it's a little bit prisony or a little bit criminal justice-y. So if there's anything that's not making sense, let me know. It's also worth knowing from the outset that I will give a couple of case examples as we go along, but that will cover a variety of different topics and offences, and some of those might be quite sensitive to you. So just if there's anything that makes you uncomfortable, or if there's anything that you think this is not what I want to hear, that's all right. Feel free to kind of drop out and come back in, because some of those things that we will be covering might be things like or will be things like sex offences, domestic violence. And while there will be nothing that's too graphic, I know that those are quite emotive topics for people. I hope that that's all right. We'll start at the very beginning. I believe it is a very good place to start. Restorative justice, in a nutshell, what I'm referring to when I say that, it's a process that brings two parties into contact with each other, into safe, facilitated, risk-managed contact. And there's two parties that we'll talk about. There's the people who have been harmed by crime or conflict. Very typically, we call them victims. And there's the people who are responsible for causing that harm. Sometimes we call them harmers, offenders, perpetrators. There's various terminology like that. We're bringing those two parties into contact with each other. Sometimes that's face-to-face, that's direct, that's two people sitting in the same room, making eye contact with each other and having a conversation. And sometimes there's more indirect approaches. And sometimes that's things like letters, audio recordings, video recordings, third-party mediation, and as of like 2020, Zoom and Teams and all of those sorts of things. So with that in mind, the next question that you're probably going to be asking, and it's a very good question, is why on earth would anybody want to do anything like that? Loads of different reasons why people choose it. Now, it's worth saying from the outset that restorative justice is a voluntary process. It's voluntary for victims and it's voluntary for offenders. At any stage, either party can bow out. And that's quite common because sometimes what people start off with and the things that they start off by wanting from this process, sometimes they go so far and go, that's enough, that will do me. Or maybe this is not what I thought it would be. So to that end, it's voluntary. There's lots of different reasons why victims choose to engage with this process. There's loads of different reasons why offenders choose to engage with this process. It can be initiated by either party with some exceptions, but we'll come to those exceptions a little bit later on. If we start by talking about victims of crime, the people who have been harmed, the most common reasons where we tend to see that victims want to be engaged with this process are, number one, it's a way of overcoming some fear. So whenever I don't know if you have ever been the victim of a crime. I don't even know if you've been the perpetrator of a crime. To each their own. But for some victims, what they are looking for is a way to overcome the fear that has come about as a result of this offence. I have just finished working on a case. It's taken about 14 months now. And it was an armed robbery. It was a young man who was held at gunpoint by two offenders. And he met with both of them. He's met with both of them in the past fortnight. And he wanted very different things from both of those offenders. But for one of them, his idea of success in this process was being able to sit in the same room as one of those young men and be able to look them in the eye and to be able to make eye contact with him and to realize that he wasn't as frightening as the person that he remembered who was holding a gun 5 years ago. That was a massive thing for him. And that was his main reason for wanting to engage in that process. For those who have perhaps been a victim of maybe an acquisitive crime like a burglary or something like an assault, it's very easy and it's very common for victims of crime to have an idea in their mind of what that offender looks like. And the longer that process goes on, the more that picture distorts. So very commonly what we find is victims who think, my goodness, that person, he was 7 foot tall and he had laser beams for eyes and he had 2 heads and he was built like a tank. And at the point where they meet, sometimes in a prison, sometimes in a neutral space, what they find is, well, that person looks like a person and they're human sized and they're not quite the bad person that I had in my head. They're not quite that as extreme as I had in my head. So sometimes that can be a reason why people engage with that. A second reason can be to have the opportunity to explain the impact of an offence. Now that might sound a little bit strange, but if you think about it, what offenders, what harmers of crime are able to do is they're able to admit responsibility for the action they took. So you can have an offender who says, yes, I did that. I burgled that house. I assaulted that person. I caused the death of that person. They can talk about that offense, but however, they will not know the impact of that offense on a victim unless that victim tells them. So very commonly, if we take a burglary as our example again, what we have is victims who will say things like, as a result of what you did, I have had to use up all my annual leave in sorting out the mess that was caused. The insurance premiums on my insurance have skyrocketed as a result of what you did. I have a lot of arguments with my partner as a result of what's happened, because he thinks that I left the door unlocked, but I think he left the window unlocked. As a result of what you did, my children don't sleep well at night because they think that there's someone coming back. Maybe someone will be saying, as a result of what happened, I'm on anti-anxiety medication. I'm now seeing a counsellor. My life is not as it was, and I need you to hear about the damage that you caused. For some people, that's what restorative justice is, the opportunity to say, as a result of what you did, this consequence happened for me. The third reason is an opportunity to ask questions. This is one of the most common reasons why we tend to find that victims of crime want to engage in this process. I think, and this is my view on it, I think in a lot of cases, offences don't make sense to victims of crime. They make sense to the offenders for a lot of time, for 90% of the time, because of an offender knows the plan that went, everything that went through from beginning to end. If you were the victim of crime, you were involved in a tiny bit of that. So, for example, if you come home one night and discover that your house is being burgled, you're only involved in that tiny bit, that discovery. If you have been assaulted, you're involved in that tiny bit, that assault. And there's questions that come out of that. Now, some of those questions are very common. They're ones that in this room or in these various rooms, we may all ask of ourselves. So if we take, again, the example of burglary, it might be that the question you want to know is, why me? Why my house? Why was I chosen? What was so special about, what was of such interest that made you do that? Why me is the most common one. But sometimes there are things that are more personal, depending on the offense, depending on the circumstances. It may be that the questions that you want to know as the victim of a burglary might be things like, not only why in this street of houses was it mine that you chose, but how did you get in? I thought my security was pretty good. The things you took make no sense to me. So you took this that cost £5 and I bought it in a charity shop, but you left this, which was really expensive, and that doesn't make sense to me. Where in my house did you go? How long were you there? What did you do? What did you do with my stuff? Where did my belongings go? Are you coming back? Were you watching in some way? Have you been scoping out my property for some time, or was this a bit opportunistic? Those are the sorts of questions that, if there isn't an answer, it's very easy to revisit over and over and over again and worry at those thoughts. It's difficult to put those things to rest if you don't have answers. To give you a very silly example, a case I worked on many years ago was a burglary. It was a young man broke into a house of a family, and as far as it went, the family were fairly resigned to this. A lot of it made sense. They said the guy broke into our house. He stole the car keys. That makes sense. He stole an iPad. That makes sense. The thing they got stuck on, they said, he went into our kitchen and he emptied out the fruit bowl and he lined all of the fruit on the kitchen table. And that's the thing that doesn't make sense to me. And I could see where they were coming from. That was a fair enough point. It was something that made them go, what did that mean? What did he do to the fruit? Why is it like that? And we took the opportunity to approach this offender and say, well, what was that about? That makes no sense. And he said, the answer was very simple. He said, my mum always used to keep all of her spare change at the bottom of our fruit bowl. So I thought everybody did that. So I thought I'd check. There wasn't any. It was just fruit. Well, yeah, it's a fruit bowl. But that was the thing for that family that helped them go, oh, that makes sense. I don't need to think about it anymore. That's fine. Other people have very personal questions that they want to ask as a result of the offence that's happened to them. So if I look, for example, on the case list that I have at the moment, some of those more common questions that I'm helping people answer are things like, in the case of that young man I talked about before, there was a gun on that night. Were you ever going to use it? How much danger was I in? In some instances, in some more upsetting instances, a case of death by dangerous driving, a mum, it was the mother of the deceased who wanted to meet with the offender. And she wanted to know about what her, the circumstances were that there was 2 young men who had been driving up and down at speed on Kirkstall Road. The driver had lost control of the car had overturned, and the passenger was killed. The person who wanted to engage with restorative justice was the mother of the deceased. And her questions were very simple ones, but for her very impactful. She wanted to know what her son's last afternoon was like. Where were they going? What were they doing? What were they talking about? At the point of his death, was he happy? Things that don't make an awful lot of difference in some ways. At the end of the day, her son is still deceased. But her feedback to us was, as his mum, it makes the world of difference for me to know the answers to those questions. They're the things that help me get out of bed in the morning. If answering questions is something that you need to do, then that's what we look at. 4th reason is to understand more about why the offence happened. And that kind of comes in under the asking questions and explaining the impact. We've talked a little bit about that. 5th, to put a face to the name. Yes, of course. That happens a lot, particularly in your acquisitive crimes, for example, like your burglaries, where you come home and discover that something has happened. And a lot of victims of crime we find can spend time going, I don't know who did this. Was it someone that I knew? Is it someone that I've never seen before? Is it someone who lives near me? Or was it a complete stranger? And I would like the opportunity to see that face rather than walking down the street going, is it you? Is it you? Is it you? Is it you? It helps put those things to bed, so to speak. And if things go to court or someone gets charged and they go to prison, there's a good chance that that offender may just be a name on a piece of paper, or they might be a really frightening mugshot. And this is an opportunity to go, what are you actually like? Show me your face. Most importantly, that's what all of these things add up to, is closure. That idea of being able to move past something, move beyond something, put something to rest. The purpose of restorative justice in West Yorkshire, certainly the purpose of our organisation, is to help victims of crime cope and recover following an offence. If it helps the offender too, so much the better. But in the first instance, it's to help the victim cope and recover in a way that makes sense to them. I hope that makes sense so far. We're going to go on to the next slide, which is about why would an offender want to do restorative justice? Now, this takes a little bit more wrapping your head around. And certainly one of the surprises in my life has been that whenever I started working in restorative justice, and that was at a time when I worked in HMP Leeds, one of the surprises I found is that I had a waiting list. I thought that I would have to spend an awful lot of time convincing offenders that this was something that they probably should think about doing. But for the most part, I had an awful lot of people coming to me and going, yeah, I need to do this. I have reasons that I need to do this. I need to engage in this process for the person that I've harmed, but also for myself. So there's about 4 very common reasons why we find that offenders want to engage in restorative justice. The first one is if there's something about that offence that was unintentional. And the case in point is things like death by dangerous driving, where nobody woke up that morning going, I know what I'll do today. I will end somebody's life. Death by dangerous driving is something where just everything has gone wrong, hasn't it? In a way that burglaries or assaults, domestic violence, sex offense, other offences, there's an element of premeditation in it, which hasn't necessarily happened with things like death by dangerous driving. Or it might be that there was a part of that offence where things didn't go to plan. if that makes sense as well. So that can be a reason why we find that offenders are approaching us saying, yeah, this is something that I need to engage in. Second reason is that potentially they were under some form of drug or alcohol at the point of the offence. And maybe later down the line, whenever they're in a police cell or they're in the first night centre in the prison, they've been shown the footage of what they've done, sometimes by body-worn cameras, sometimes through CCTV. Sometimes they've been told about the offence that they've committed, the thing that they've done, and that hasn't sat comfortably, one reason or another. We hear stories quite frequently in general life, as well as in restorative justice, of people who have had a few too many, been under the influence of something, and have little recollection of it the next day. It happens with offences too. So there's something about that that makes people go, I need to fix that. That does not sit comfortably with me. Third reason is sometimes just some time has passed. Some time has passed. That offender has grown up a little bit, has maybe matured a little bit. Sometimes, particularly if they're still engaged with prison or probation, it might be that they've done some victim impact work, some victim awareness work, and that might have given them a little bit more of a teaching or an understanding of how what they've done has affected other people. I was in Humber, HMP Humber, the other day, and I was working with a man he has been found guilty of a murder many years ago, and he has approached our organisation and he said, I want to do restorative justice. And in conversation, I said, why now? This is something that, this is an offence that happened years and years ago. And he said, yeah, but when I was younger, I was of the belief that I didn't have to explain myself to anybody. The only person I affected was myself. And the older I get, and the more I think about it, particularly over the past 15 months, the more I realize that that's not true. That there's people around me who have been damaged by what I've done. And maybe that's something I need to put right. He had been of the opinion of, well, I killed somebody, and the only person I would really have to explain myself to is that person, and I can't because they're no longer with us. However, having done some work, he recognized that person he killed had friends and family of his own, and maybe they had questions, and maybe that's something he could help with. Sometimes people just grow up a little bit. Time passes. Sometimes people have a similar experience themselves where they have been an offender, but now they're a victim or a member of their family is, and they start to realize, oh, I caused that damage too. I did something similar. I should maybe do something about that. Fourth most common reason is maybe they've found out something about that victim, sometimes through the court, sometimes the police, that maybe they weren't aware of at the time. One of the more common things that I hear in this job is, oh, if I'd known that, I never would have done it. Well, don't do it, is maybe too easy an answer. An example of that is 2 summers ago, I worked on a case where there was a street robbery, and the offender approached us and he said, I want to do restorative justice. I robbed this guy at knife point. I took his property, and then the police told me that my victim had autism. And my youngest brother has autism, and I know that if this had happened to him, this would really have messed him up. So I need to meet with him, and I need to tell him it's all right, so that he is all right, and I feel better too. Fifth, it's very simply to apologize. It's surprising how often that comes up, and it's especially whenever it's an offender who has done something very serious. Sometimes what they want to do more than anything is to apologize for those actions, very commonly. If we go a little bit more specific, what kind of offences can restorative justice be used with? Now, some of that we've already kind of discussed as we've been going along, because I've been giving you little examples. But very generally speaking, any offence where there is an identified victim, an identified offender, and an identified offence, we can use restorative justice. Now, that sounds like all of them, doesn't it? And that's fair. But there are certain offences, things like possession of drugs, supply of drugs, where we know there's a definite offender and we know there's a definite crime. But sometimes there's not a specific victim. Sometimes what we find is that the argument is that society is the victim of those crimes. And that is absolutely true, no problem. But the problem with that is society tends not to have a phone number or a contact address. If there is someone who says, as a result of this crime, I was harmed, then we can look at that. But where there is not an identifiable victim, then we can't. So I trust that makes a little bit of sense. When I first started working in restorative justice many moons ago, there were certain offences that we did not look at, we did not touch. And that was on beliefs at the time, and it was backed up by the Restorative Justice Council, which is kind of like the governing body of restorative justice. And the general consensus of the time was restorative justice, any offence you like, apart from sex offences and domestic violence offences. Now, that is still to a certain extent the case, but there's been some changes with that. So with regards to that, what we have moved to, and the reason that we thought that way is these are very complex offences. We don't want to do anything to re-victimize the victim or cause trauma. There's so many power plays and power dynamics and relationship dynamics at play. It's maybe a way of getting, of helping the offender control the victim in some way, and we don't want to be part of that. Those all made sense. We've moved on a bit, and in 2021, the way that we tend to approach offences like domestic violence and sex offences is if these are victim initiated, then, and if we can make those the scenarios safe, then we will look at those cases and working on those cases. If they are offender initiated, we will not engage in restorative justice in those particular offences for those reasons we've described. What we find is that we have increasingly victims of sex offences, victims of domestic violence approaching us and saying, I need this for myself. I need this to be able to move on in some sort of way. Okay, I need this for myself in some sort of way. It might be that they went to the police at the time, that offender is in prison, that they were charged. It might be that the criminal justice system took that victim so far and now they need something else for themselves, something else for their well-being, something else to help them be able to move past things. It falls into that sense of closure that we talked about before. So an example, and one of the first cases that we did in West Yorkshire, which involved a victim of a sex offence, she approached us and she said, I want to engage in restorative justice. She had been the victim of a sexual assault in her home. And she talked about, and I have an almost direct quote here. She said, at the point where the perpetrator left my house, he left my bedroom, I was curled up in a corner of my room, making the most pathetic sound I've ever heard myself make. I have never heard myself make it before, and I have never heard myself make it since. But for me, I hate the idea that that is his lasting impression of me. And what I would like for myself is to be able to sit in a room across from him, explain the impact that he had on me, and then leave. That is the bit that I need now to be able to move past this. And the discussion that went on as a result of that case, not only within our team, but more nationwide than that was, well, if that's what you need, and if we can make it safe, then okay, let's give this a go. It almost feels wrong to deny you that if it's something we can offer. I trust that makes sense. I know that particularly sex offences, domestic violence cases are contentious issues, but that's the rationale that we're currently working on. What I've found in West Yorkshire, what we're finding as a team, is that we're being approached by a lot of victims, particularly of historic child sex offences, where those victims, now adults, are approaching us and saying, I'm starting to realise the full impact that this has had on me, and this is something I would like to engage in. The things that I went through as a child, I am now processing as an adult, and that is part of the reason why I think I need to engage in this process for my own well-being. I don't know why that's particularly the case in West Yorkshire. It's not necessarily the case up and down the rest of the country. If you can throw any light on that, I would be happy to hear it. Certainly, it's not something that we expected whenever we started on this particular restorative justice contract. We were expecting the burglaries, the assaults, the robberies, the shoplifting. We're expecting those cases. We were not expecting those victims to approach us and say, yeah, we need this too. With that in mind, it's why we've changed some of our processes. If we look down the rest of that slide, we've talked about that first one. And to that end, it does, restorative justice does not have to be used in a recent offence. Like I talked about, some of those are historic offences. And that comes up for various reasons. A guy that approached us and was the victim of a childhood sexual offence said, I thought that I had dealt with a lot of this stuff. And then I had children of my own, and they are now at the age that I was whenever that abuse happened. And now I look at them and I realize how wrong it was what happened to me. I kind of thought at the time that it was partially my fault, but now I look at my children and I realize how it couldn't possibly have been. And to that end, I want to engage with this process. The offender, if we move down to the third point, the offender does not have to have gone to prison. Some offences that we deal with are dealt with through out of court disposals, or where one party is with probation, like in a community order, or it may be that that offender is now long out of prison, that they have finished their sentence and are away. The victim, nor does the victim have to wait for the offender to be released. We have done a lot of work with the prisons in West Yorkshire and beyond, and for the most part, a lot of them are very receptive to restorative justice and the need for it. We have strong ties with HMP Wakefield, HMP Leeds, HMP Wealdstone, which are some of the more common places where victims and offenders in West Yorkshire go. Also Newhall, which is the female prison establishment. And farther afield, Humber tends to be a place where a lot of people from West Yorkshire wind up going. It's a longer term jail. So we do a lot of work there. But I don't want to say it's the luck of the draw, but sometimes with certain offenders and certain offences, you find yourself trailing up and down the country, because if that's where they are, that's where they've got to be. That's where you've got to go to. So in the past week, I have been in Stockton to HMP Kirklevington, to Wealdstone out by Wetherby, to Humber over in Humberside Way. Yeah, you put in the miles. And we've already talked about the sex offence and domestic violence cases. Do they have to meet? Now, that's a very good question. Do they have to have that face-to-face discussion? No, not necessarily. Restorative justice looks like different things for different people. For some people, what they want is that I'm sitting in the same room as you, we're sharing the same space, we're having this conversation together, and it's a two-way thing. For some people, it's almost a I want to see the whites of their eyes sort of thing. For other people, they don't want that. And there's loads of reasons why they might not. It might be fear is still a big factor. It might just be down to things like time restraints or geography. So a case that I have been working on, which occurred in Leeds. The offender is currently in HMP Stafford, but the victim is from Newcastle. So geography is a big factor to some victims and offenders, where people can't necessarily take time out of their day, of their life, of their family, of their commitments in order for a face-to-face meeting to happen. But they still have those questions or those things that they want to say. And to that end, we look at more indirect approaches. And the way that we look at more indirect processes are things like letters, audio recordings, video recordings. Third parties like me kind of go in between and saying, well, this is what he said and this is what she responded. For some people, fear is a very big factor. And for some people, that fear isn't necessarily of the offender. It might be of the prison. For those of you who have travelled past HMP Leeds, it looks like a dungeon. It's a frightening and intimidating looking place. And it can be a really big ask to some victims of crime to say, do you want to meet the person who's caused you this harm? But also, do you want to meet them in there? Now, for some people, the answer to that question is absolutely, yes, I do. But for some, it's no, can we find a different way? And that's fine. In some instances, those letters, those audio recordings, those video recordings, they can be as impactful as the face-to-face meeting. I will give you an example. I have a letter here. This went to, the case was an assault on a police officer. And the police officer, to a certain extent, went, this is part of my job. However, if there's an apology forthcoming, I would quite like to have it, but I don't necessarily have the time or inclination to be in the same room as the person who has harmed me. So if there is something that they want to say, they could put it in writing. And the apology came as such. I will not give you the PC's name, nor will I give you the offender name. So this will be anonymized. The letter reads, first of all, the main thing that I want to say to you is that I'm sorry. There was a lot of things going on in the night that you came to my house. The situation got out of hand. I was trying to sort things out myself, but I was drinking and I couldn't find my phone, and there was too many people in my house who shouldn't have been. And at the point at which you came to see what was going on, I was frustrated and aggressive, and I took it out on you, and I shouldn't have. When I was shown back the footage that you had of me on that night, I was embarrassed. I didn't recognize myself. I've had to do a lot of thinking about myself as a result, and I've realized there's a lot of issues in my life I haven't addressed. I don't want to make excuses because I know I was out of order, and no matter what my issues are, I shouldn't be taking it out on you. But as a result of the caution I got, I've taken up some of the anger management support and some counselling sessions that have been offered to me that I didn't realize I needed before. I've also massively cut down on the amount of alcohol I've been drinking. I do not want to repeat what happened that night. I wish I could go back and undo it, but I know that I can't. So I will try and make something positive come from it instead. If I were in your position, I'd be angry, I'd be disappointed, especially when your job is just trying to help people at a time that's already difficult. I feel bad for what I've put you through. I'm sorry for my part in it. I'm sorry for the injuries I caused, and I hope there's no lasting damage. It was not my intention to hurt anyone, but still, that happened, and I'm sorry. If you have your own questions about what happened, I'd be happy to answer them as best I can. Please let, that was me, Nate, please let Caroline know she can pass on your comments, but again, please accept my apologies, and please know that I'm doing things to make sure it never happens again. That was something for that particular police officer. The police officer said, I don't want to sit in a room with someone. I don't want to hear from them. But written down, having like a tangible piece of paper where someone had put in a bit of effort meant a great deal to them. Made them slightly less cynical about the next job that they went to, which sounded like that. And they phoned that offender, and they thanked them for that letter. And they're on better footing. I mean, that's not to say that everybody's friends forevermore, but sometimes indirect methods can be just as effective as the face-to-face sitting in the same room as people. It's worth thinking about things just a little bit like this. We've got the traditional criminal justice system for its good and its bad, for its flaws and its benefits. And there's some bits of it that make sense, and I completely understand why they're like that. And there's some bits that we kind of look at stuff a little bit differently in terms of restorative justice. So, for example, if I were to come to your house now, I'm not going to, but if I were to come to your house now, and if I were to knock on your door, and when you open the door, I were to punch you in the face and break your nose. Again, I will not do that. The problem that we have, according to the criminal justice system, is that in this country, we have a book of law. And all the laws of this country are written there. And I have broken one of them. It's almost an administrative thing. It's not that I've caused you harm. It's not that I've caused the people around you harm. It's that I broke one of those laws. The victim, if you were to phone the police, and you would be right to do so, if you were to phone the police and the police were to arrest me and I were to go to court, the victim would not be you. If you went through all the paperwork that would be generated, it would take pages before your name came up. The victim is the Queen. The Queen is the most offended against person in the UK, but to the best of my knowledge, she is not in West Yorkshire this evening. In restorative justice, what we say is that the victim is anyone affected, be that you, be that the people around you. And wrongdoing is anything that's caused harm. The focus, as we have in the justice system, is what happened and who do we blame and what do we do about me? And I get that. Whenever a crime happens, what the police are interested in, and rightly so, is who did it and what will we do about them? What will we do about me coming to your house and assaulting you? There is little focus on you, and you're the person who has been harmed. You're the person who has been damaged. You are the person going, how did this happen? Why did this happen? The debt is repaid not by punishment, but by repairing that harm and making things right. In this country in particular, those two things go hand in hand. I am not for 1 minute saying that we scrap out the entire criminal justice system and replace it with restorative justice, but the two go very well together. One deals primarily with the offender, the other deals primarily with the victim, and there's overlaps in it. And that's fine. Your needs as the victim are primary in restorative justice. We talk about how you have been harmed and what needs to happen in order to make things right. It might be that what you need from me is for me to explain what on earth happened. It might be what you need from me is to never darken your door again. To each their own. Everybody wants something different from this process. Everybody wants something that makes sense to them. In the justice system that we have, the victim's needs are very secondary. For some cases, the night that the victim calls that offence in may be the last time that they are involved in the criminal justice system. Whereas that is not the case in restorative justice. The focus is very much upon them. One of the things I particularly like about this, about restorative justice, one of the things that we focus on is on the off chance that those two parties meet again in the future, as inevitably you always meet the person you don't want to see again. If you were to bump into each other, you know, in the middle of Tesco's one night, how do you want each other to behave? Do you want that offender to come over and say hi? Do you want them to turn around, put their shopping down and leave? It's something that takes away a massive amount of stress for people because they know how they're expected to behave moving forward. In the case of the robbery that I talked about with the, the robbery that had the restorative justice meeting last week, where the young man was held at gunpoint by two offenders, the way that they answered that question at the end of their meeting was, whenever we said, how do you want things to be? Should you meet each other in the future? Both of them said, come and say hi. And if the pubs are open, I'll buy you a drink. Well, that's strange. And that's definitely not where I thought this case would have ended, because of the level of trauma that the victim experienced at the very start of this process. It's not the place I expected it to end, but it was. There's nothing short of miraculous, to be honest. You could probably do with a short break from my voice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a short video. It's called The Wolf Within. Now, this is about a guy called Peter Wolf. He's a real person. Peter Wolf lives in London, and it's estimated by London Metropolitan, London Metropolitan Police that in his lifetime, he has committed about 10,000 offences. We are not going to watch a video of him meeting all of those people. We would be there until the end of time. But this is a very short video about him meeting with one of those people, a guy called Will Riley.
I couldn't really even begin to tell you how many crimes I've committed. I was once described as a walking crime wave. I was quite chuffed by that. I've always drunk. I used to love a drink, even as a kid. It was a way of life. I started taking drugs when I was 10. So all of a sudden I looked round and I was sticking needles in myself. I was an heroin addict. I'd stayed in a squat over at East London, which I'll describe it to you. It was human waste all over the floor, syringes and empty beer cans everywhere, blood squirted up the wall from the syringes. My bed was an old mattress that we'd found in the dustbin, and my blankets were the clothes I slept in. I stunk to high heaven. That's how I lived. All this time I was taking other drugs, drinking copious amounts of alcohol, committing crime on a daily basis, sometimes on a multi-daily basis, 10 times a day crimes. It depended on how much you earned.
It's about 5 o'clock. I'm in my office, which is in the first floor, and it's time to go to the gym. I go upstairs, and as I walk up to the top landing, I push open the door, and there's a man that I'd never seen before.
He says, "What are you doing?" It's my house. "What are you doing in here?" and I give him some old flannel. I said, oh, I live over the road at number 2 and I see someone acting suspiciously and I heard a funny noise.
And I said, where's number 2?
I said, over there. But unfortunately it was over there. And so he knew I was telling lies and he knew I was a burglar.
He unfortunately ran into a kitchenette that we have on the top floor and shouted knife. And so I thought, oh, God, now we're in real trouble.
And I had this guy after me and I didn't get a knife. I got the top of the oven, heavy old thing, cast iron, and I put it, smashed him over there behind me.
Which hurt, but again, I'm pumping, so I don't feel it very much.
He stumbled and we fought, and as we fought, we rolled down a flight of stairs, proper John Wayne stuff going on there, and there was a big old flower pot, and I picked it up and smashed him straight over the head with that. And I remember the blood coming out of his head.
And I kept going, and we bundled and fought and bundled and fought. And I got him outside the door, and I said, help me, help me. And it just looked like 2 middle-aged men having a ding-dong. And then the police car came, so obviously someone had to call the police.
The police pull up and I'm nicked in the back of the van.
They said to me, are you okay? And I said, yeah, I'm fine. And I said, well, you're bleeding. And as I put my hand behind my head, I've got my whole head is just saturated in blood.
I'm not about to sit there feeling remorseful and sorry. It was just a bad day at the office for me, so I'm off to prison and, oh well, can't wait to get to prison because get to prison, that means I can get some drugs.
My wife came to collect me in the hospital, and as I put the key in the door, I suddenly had a fear that there would be somebody at the other side of the door. And it happened day after day after day after day. And it's not a very nice feeling. You feel scared. So about 2 or 3 weeks later, a police officer called me and he said that we're conducting a study on a thing called Restorative Justice where the offender meets the victim. Would you be interested in taking part?
If I'm honest, part of me sort of wanted to say sorry to this fella, but the majority of me only wanted to do the Restorative Justice conference to get out of the cell for an hour. Suddenly this day came and the screw, the prison officer, opened my door. It was a lunchtime. And he said, come on then. I'm walking along this passageway. Whether or not it's true, I don't know, but apparently the screws used to say this was where the condemned man used to go. And at that very moment, I started to feel like a condemned man. I'm thinking, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to go and meet the victims of my crimes. I don't want to meet anyone. I just want to go and lay in my bed. And we get up to the door and I'm thinking, I don't want to be here. I just don't want to be here. Just as I went to say it, the door opened.
And there is a guy I fought about 2 months earlier, and he's in a sort of prison garb and looking really sheepish. And, I'm beginning to think, what the hell are we doing here? But anyway, it's going to happen. Whatever it is, it's going to happen. So here we go.
So I started going on about the poor old me's and how I've had an hard life and giving all the social spiel, because all my life that's what I've done, give social spiel to probation officers and social workers. I thought I had everyone eating out the palm of my hands.
He's just going through the movements, just going through the same old lines, the same old trite. And I'm beginning to get very, very annoyed, very, very annoyed.
And it came to a point, and I said to
Will, when we first met. And that's it. And I just lose it completely.
And he started listing all the things that I've done. And he also started listing his feelings.
And it comes out like a fire hydrant. And I said to him, we didn't meet in some bloody cocktail bar in Islington. You broke into my house. You destroyed my one belief that I had, which is my ability to protect my family, my house, from people like you, and you did it in one fell swoop.
I never knew it made people feel sad, angry, bad, depressed, isolated, guilty about things I'd done, yeah? I didn't know.
Peter was just, it was like a train hitting him. You could see that he God, I've done this.
It was like a flow of emotion started coming out, and I never realised it. I just never realised the damage I'd done. I never realised the harms I caused. I never realised how many people it affected.
And here was a man who wasn't showing remorse because the lawyer had said, you've got to show remorse, you get time off. Here was a man who was genuinely affected by what we had said. And we start conversing, we start talking, and Peter starts talking. He starts talking from his heart, from his real core of his existence.
When you hear the damage, what you have done, when you hear the harm you've caused, you've got to be a very, very bitter and twisted human being if this doesn't affect you. You've got to be a sicko. I was fully expecting these people who I'd done a lot of harm to say, lock him up, give him the birch, throw away the key, we don't care. But I was quite amazed. So I went back to that cell and sat there with all these feelings, you know, and I sat with them for a long time trying to work them out and separate them. And
you can't just leave him there. You've got to help him help himself. So therefore, we then went out and said, listen, we want to see you change. We want to see you get yourself together. We want to help you in this process.
We'd like to see him address his alcohol and addiction problems. We'd like to see him address his offending problems. We'd like to see him maybe get some education, and we'd like to see him even get a job when he gets out.
In a court of law, the victim sits in a public gallery. He, she, his family, his loved ones are the most affected by this crime, and then the least involved in the process.
They don't get no input into it, and there's questions that need answering, and they can't possibly answer these questions unless they meet the harmer, the wrongdoer, the villain of the piece, the criminal.
And that's all this is bringing people around. Well, it happened to be a prison table, but I mean, it could be anywhere, and having them saying, well, why did you do that? You know, do you understand how that affected me? Do you understand how that affects other people? Ever since we first met, we continue to meet. We have become, both of us, utter converts to restorative justice, to restorative approaches, to bringing offenders and victims together.
Because of that conference, it initiated change, it implemented change. I implemented the change, but it sort of gave me the kickstart I needed. You know, I can't express gratitude enough for the Restorative Justice Programme, and I've got to leave it there for a minute.
I have met Peter Wolf. He has never reoffended. He has never gone back to prison. He is very prolific on Twitter and worth following. And sometimes, if I'm perfectly honest, restorative justice can be that good. You have an offender who never offends again, a victim that fully copes and recovers. So that was 2003. In 2019, they remain friends. They still meet, they still talk, they're still involved in restorative justice. That website, that organization that Will set up, Why Me, continues to this day. Sometimes it's that good. That is not to say that that is what restorative justice looks like for everybody. There are a lot of offences, a lot of victims, a lot of offenders where it's not quite, it doesn't quite look like that. Success looks like different things for different people. So for some, for example, in the case of the woman that we talked about who met, who was the victim of the sex offence, who met the guy who assaulted her, the purpose of that was not for them to establish a better relationship. The purpose of that was her taking back control and power, and all being well, never seeing him again. That was what she wanted from that. And to a certain extent, when we've asked her, she says, if he goes back to prison or he doesn't, I don't really care, because I don't want to think about him anymore. That is what success is for her, which is very different from what it looks like for Peter and for Will. For other people, it's, as we've talked about, it's the opportunity of that dialogue and hoping for better for offenders. But for some who have particularly chaotic lifestyles, or where mental health might be a concern, or drug or alcohol misuse, sometimes there is a lifetime of behavior to overcome first, and not every offender can do that at that point. I trust that makes sense. This is some of the feedback that we've had recently from victims, from offenders, from people working with them. In the case of, for example, Jay, who was the victim of assault, she received a letter from an offender a fortnight ago, and the thing that she was able to say instantly as a result of that is, this is the letter I never thought I'd get. I forgive him 100% and instantly, and I never thought I'd say that. In the case of V, who is the perpetrator of hate crime, his comment at the end of Restorative Justice was, it never occurred to me that anyone will be affected by something I said. This was, it was a hate crime. It was a racially aggravated hate crime. I was horrified to discover that she still was 3 months later, and her husband and her kids. But now I know, I'm glad for the opportunity to apologize, because I was out of order. The thing that came from that meeting between those two parties is he asked for his apologies to be taken not only to the victim, but asked the victim to take his apologies to her children, which really helped them. We talked about, there's the direct victim and then there's the people around that. In the case of the victim of the armed robbery, and we've mentioned him a couple of times, the guy who was held at gunpoint, his feedback after meeting with one of the offenders was, I slept. I sat in a room with him and I talked to him, and now I can sleep. That was the first time he'd had a full night's sleep without sleeping tablets in 5 years. And for the offender manager of a perpetrator of shop theft, because people, like I said, people are affected that aren't just the direct victim and offender. I am so proud of him. He, the offender, really listened to them, the victims. He wanted to make sure they weren't frightened anymore, and they really made him think about the choices he'd been making. This is very much a two-way interaction. If you look on our website, which is basically a lot of the things that we do is RJ West Yorkshire. So that's our website, it's our Twitter handle, it's Facebook. I would say go on Instagram, but I haven't updated that, so don't. Those are the places where you can find information about the research that goes into restorative justice, the case studies, what our particular project is doing. But if you have more questions that you have yourself, we've also included then an email address there, which is rjwestyorkshire@restorativesolutions.org.uk. If this is something that you think, oh, actually, do you know what? I would quite like to be involved in this. We look for volunteers. We work very closely with our volunteers. So there's, on my team, there's 5 of us who are in paid employment, but we co-work cases with volunteers who come from all sorts of walks of life and bring a whole wealth of experience with them. Full training is provided, and you would work on those cases alongside a paid member of staff. If it's something that might be of interest to you or something you'd like to talk about a little bit more, please get in contact with me, because as you are discovering this evening, I will talk about this all day long.